Welcome back. In the last lesson, we were contrasting agrarianism and mercantilism, showing how those two worldviews, those two systems, don't get along. They go back to that whole idea of antithesis. They're opposed to each other. They cannot actually cooperate with each other. Well, today we're also going to take a look at what seems almost like opposites, but really these two different ideas are meant to be wedded. They're meant to be unified because they're actually complementary. One builds upon the other, and you really can't have one without the other. And those two ideas are our lesson title, which is Word and Deed. Now we're taking a look at two men who really exemplify this whole concept of word and deed, sometimes for good, sometimes for ill. And those two men, who were both U.S. presidents, are John Quincy Adams. He was the son of John Adams, and then, of course, Andrew Jackson. And the principle that I want you to set out here, the principle I want you to view these two men through is simple. It's this: liberty requires both right word and right deed. In other words, if you're going to have freedom, if you're going to have something like justice, mercy, and humility, you must actually have both right word and right deeds. So let's go ahead and unpack those two ideas. We'll start with right word. Now, the term for right word that we use in theology, a term that goes back to the Greek, is the term orthodoxy. And orthodoxy just means right way or right truth or even right path. And the thing about orthodoxy, or the thing about right word, is it has a very simple basis, and that's this: the scriptures themselves, which are without error, which are absolute, actually reveal a Trinitarian Yahweh. And so we use the scriptures as our entire basis of truth. They're meant to actually guide us into truth, but also into beauty and into goodness. They're meant to actually nourish us. But the scriptures always pose one primary question, or at least we should be asking one primary question when we approach the scriptures. And that is, what has God said? Specifically, what has God said about himself? See, the scriptures are primarily concerned with who God is, with the fact that he's outside of all time. He's outside of all space. He's infinite. He's someone who made all things, yet does not need any of this. He is someone who needs nothing. He needs no force. He needs no person to actually sustain him or to give him completion. He's complete and perfect all of his own. He's someone who made all of this for reasons simply because he wanted to. We don't know any more beyond that than what he's told us. But the scriptures also ask the question, or really answer the question, what has God said about us, about mankind? In other words, who are we? How are we made? How are we both physical and spiritual? How have we been affected by sin? And thus, how are we affected in the way that we live in this world? And how is the world even affected by sin? The scriptures ask all and answer all of those questions. But the other question we should approach with is, what has God said about salvation? What has he said about actually restoring man to himself? Since, after all, he as creator made the creation to worship himself and to enjoy himself, not because he needed it, but simply because he desired to do so. Yet we desperately need him. We desperately are incomplete without him. And so thus, we need to know how are we to be restored to him, and that's the whole model of salvation. And so, right word always is important as a basis. If you don't know the truth, if you don't know the right path, then you cannot do right deeds, which is the second part of this principle. Now, another word for right deeds is not orthodoxy. In this case, it's what we call orthopraxy, which means right practice. It means the right doing of something. In other words, when you approach a task, there's typically a right way and a wrong way to do something. And so right deed is really the whole concept of of holiness. It's really the whole idea that when you have the truth, you actually must apply it in the way that you live. That is the whole aspect of beauty and the whole aspect of goodness. In fact, the book of James has something to say about this, about what religion actually is, or what truth is applied. James says this. He says, "Religion that is pure and undefiled before God the Father is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction, and to keep oneself unstained from the world." In other words, the way that we apply right word is through right deed, and the way that we do that is through personal holiness, and particularly through actually helping those who need help, specifically the widows and the orphans. And so the whole deal with right word and right deed is they need each other, but even more importantly, you can't have them without Christ himself. They both actually point to the sovereign God, but since we are separated from him by sin, they ultimately point to Christ, who unifies us with God himself, which is the final goal. In other words, Christians don't really think of heaven as the final reward, or at least that shouldn't be the way it's thought of. Heaven is kind of the benefit we get from being with God for all eternity. It's the new heavens and the new earth. But the actual pursuit, the actual goal, is God himself. Now, John Quincy Adams was a curious individual who understood a great deal about right deeds and particularly practiced those things. But as we'll see, right word was something that he struggled with. Andrew Jackson, on the other hand, was someone who had a very firm basis in right word, and sometimes had a very firm basis in right deeds as well, but certainly not always. It's why he's a very controversial figure in the whole era of American history. But those are the stories for the next lessons.